March 24th, 1945, over Germany, 30,000 feet. The sky above Berlin wasn't blue. It was gray, burnt gray. Flak bursts hung in the air like black flowers, opening and dying in the same second. Inside a B-17 bomber, the nose glass was shaking. Aluminum skin rattled. Everything smelled like cold oil and burned cordite. The intercom was chaos. 2 o'clock high. Watch that jet. Stay tight, stay tight. Then a different voice cut in, calmer, controlled. This is Red Tail 1. We've got you. Do not break formation. The pilot of the bomber froze for half a second. He knew that call sign, Red Tail, the men with the crimson-painted rudders, the men they joked about in the mess hall, the men some of them swore they'd never trust in combat. The bomber's right waist gunner looked out past the wing and saw them. P-51 Mustangs sliding into position, long nose, bubble canopy catching the pale sun, the tails, bright red. One Mustang rolled, fast, hard, and clean, cutting between the bomber stream and a climbing German fighter. No panic, no show, just absolute control. Flak kept blooming. The bomber kept shaking, but the P-51s held the line and matched speed. They refused to leave. Stay with us. We're not letting you go. The crew in the B-17 didn't say anything back, because in that moment, every man on that plane understood something he hadn't said out loud before. The only thing between them and a black crater in Berlin was a group of pilots America told them were not ready to fly. And now they would not fly without them. This story isn't about medals, not the victory parades, not the photo ops, not the speeches that came years later when everyone suddenly pretended they always believed in these men. It's about what happened on that day over Berlin and in the hours after, when white bomber crews, men who had laughed at the idea of Negro fighter pilots, started making quiet requests. Not, send us anybody. It became, we want the red tails. Because by March 1945, the lie had already died. They weren't unfit. They weren't not ready. They were the only reason some of those crews ever landed again. The United States Army Air Forces did not build the Red Tails to celebrate anyone. They built them to prove a point, and the point was ugly. In 1941, the logic inside the War Department was simple, and it was written down in neat official language. Black men were not psychologically suited for high-speed combat flying. They were said to lack discipline under pressure. They were better used as ground crews, truck drivers, labor. That was the assumption. That was doctrine. And doctrine in war is treated like math. You don't argue with math. So the solution, on paper, looked neat. Fine, we'll train them separately. We'll put them all in one program in Alabama, far from white units, far from media, far from embarrassment. We'll watch them fail in a controlled environment. Then we can say, see, we tried. They called it the Tuskegee program, Tuskegee, Alabama, red dirt airstrips, heat that made the cockpit smell like hot canvas and sweat, hand-me-down aircraft that other groups didn't want anymore. That's where young men like Lee Archer, Charles McGee, Roscoe Brown learned to fly fighters. They were taught in isolation. They ate in isolation. They slept in isolation. They weren't allowed to train beside white pilots. They were told, to their faces, you will never fly combat in Europe. Be realistic. And still, they kept going. Here's the part nobody ever admits out loud. For a long time, the Tuskegee Project wasn't really about creating combat pilots. It was about creating proof that the old belief was correct. If they washed out, the system wins. If they broke under pressure, the system wins. If one of them made a fatal mistake in combat, shut the whole thing down and lock every other black pilot out forever. That was the quiet deal. You can hear it in the way early missions were assigned. When the 332nd Fighter Group, the unit that would become the Red Tails, finally deployed overseas, they weren't given the glamorous missions. They weren't given go hunt aces. They weren't told go make headlines. They were told escort bombers, stay with the bombers, do not chase targets, do not improvise, do not go off script. Understand what that means. In 1944, most fighter pilots in Europe dreamed of kills. Enemy fighters shot down, tallies on the nose, personal glory. But the Red Tails were ordered not to leave the bombers, even if German fighters appeared, even if the perfect kill window opened. Why? Because their commander, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., understood something that no white commander had to think about. He told them, in plain terms, if you break formation once, if you go chasing glory once, they will say, "See, undisciplined," and they will shut us down. For white pilots, leaving the bomber stream to hunt kills made you aggressive. For black pilots, leaving the bomber stream to hunt kills would prove the stereotype. So the Red Tails flew with a different kind of pressure. Every other unit in the sky had to win the mission. They had to win the mission. And the argument. This is where the math starts to matter. Bomber crews flying deep into Germany in 1944 and early 1945 faced terrifying loss rates. There were missions where 20, 30, 40 aircraft never came home. Entire crews gone, 10 men per bomber, 10 letters home. Escort work was supposed to help with that, but escorts had a problem. Most fighter groups, after contact with German fighters, would peel off and chase. Chasing meant kills. Kills meant promotion. Chasing also meant the bombers were suddenly naked. So yes, white fighter groups had high kill counts, but bomber crews knew the truth nobody liked to say. Sometimes their protectors disappeared the second things got hot. The Red Tails didn't. Colonel Davis drilled one rule into them. If you're guarding those bombers, you die before you leave them. Harsh? Yes, but here's the result. Under Red Tail escort, bomber loss rates dropped, in some missions, to zero. Zero. You have to understand what zero sounds like in a bomber tent at night. It sounds like men breathing. It sounds like boots unlaced. It sounds like laughter that shouldn't exist, because yesterday they were sure they were done. By late 1944, word started spreading through the bomber groups in Italy, and later into the long-range missions over German industry. If you get the Red Tails, you come home. Did racism vanish? No. Did respect start to crawl in anyway, like light under a locked door? Yes. And that is the crack in the wall that becomes our story. Because by March 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group wasn't just the experiment. They were being sent on the kind of mission you only give to people you actually trust. Berlin, the capital, the heart of German flak, the last pride of the Luftwaffe. Even jet fighters, Me-262s, prowling for bomber kills. Send the men you said couldn't handle pressure. Send the men you said would panic. Yes, because the truth was already out. On the ground in America, the posters still lied. On paper, the policy still said separate. But in the air, survival had started to overrule prejudice. Bomber crews didn't care what color their escort was anymore. They cared if they got home. And there's one more detail you need to hold in your head before we go back into the sky. These black pilots knew all of this. They knew one mistake could end the entire program for every pilot who looked like them. They knew one rumor. Undisciplined, broke formation, got men killed, could justify grounding all of them. So when they climbed into their P-51 Mustangs that morning, with the tails painted red so bomber crews could spot them, they weren't just flying for themselves. They were flying for the right to exist. March 24th, 1945. Dawn over the Adriatic was pale and colorless when engines started turning. At the field in Italy, ground crews moved like ghosts under wing shadows, pulling chocks, topping off fuel, wiping oil from the cowlings of long-nosed P-51 Mustangs. Red tails, fresh paint, no nonsense. The briefing had been simple and brutal. Deep penetration, all the way in. Berlin and the refineries feeding what was left of Germany's war machine. This wasn't a short hop across the Alps. This was a knife through the ribs of the Reich. If you got hit over Berlin, you were going down over Berlin. And Berlin, in March 1945, was not a place you wanted to fall. That morning's bomber stream stretched for miles. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators, aluminum bodies glinting in weak winter sun, engines droning inside. Steady four-beat rhythm. Each one loaded with fuel and explosives meant for oil plants and rail yards that Germany needed just to keep breathing. Bomber crews said stuff like, "We're not bombing cities, we're bombing fuel." That was the story they told themselves so they could climb aboard. But the Germans knew what was coming, and they were ready to make someone pay for every drop. 06 wheels up. The red tails lifted off behind them. Here's where the math begins. A bomber group going that deep into German airspace, Berlin area targets, synthetic fuel at Pulitz, marshalling yards feeding the Rhine front, expected to lose planes. Not maybe. Expected. Luftwaffe fighters still flew, the flak guns still worked, and Germany, even this late, would gladly blow 10,000 rounds of 88mm just to rip one B-17 open and spill 10 Americans into the cold air. Everyone knew the percentages. Some crews even joked about them. You got a 10% chance of not coming back today. Only 10? Yeah, if you're lucky. That's how they talked about survival, like dice. Now look at what changed. By early 1945, bomber crews had started comparing escort groups, not on politics, on return rate. They weren't asking, are they aggressive? They were asking, do they stay? Because if your escort peeled off to chase German fighters and brag about kills, you could die in the next 60 seconds. But the 302nd, the Red Tails, they didn't peel off. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. had hammered that rule into their bones. Stay with the bombers. Die with the bombers if you have to. Do not break. That wasn't romantic. That was policy. And it was about to be tested in the ugliest airspace left in Europe, 0740. The bomber stream crossed into heavily defended German Skiet. You could feel it, the way a fishing line goes tight. The intercoms got louder. Everyone started breathing a little higher in their chest. By 8 a.m., Berlin's outer ring was in range. That meant flak. Black explosions started blooming at altitude, each one a perfect, dirty flower of metal shards. The shockwaves slapped the fuselage. You don't hear flak as boom. Boom, not from inside. You feel it. The whole airframe shudders like something alive is hitting it with a hammer. Gunners in the waist positions began calling contacts. 3 high, left bank. Stay in formation, stay in formation. And then came the next problem. Jets. The Me-262. You've heard stories about the German jet fighter. Some myth, some true. Here's the version that mattered in March 1945. It was fast. Fast enough to run circles around a B-17. Fast enough to choose the angle, choose the moment, choose who dies. Traditional escorts sometimes struggled against it. By the time a conventional fighter turned to meet the jet was already gone. If you've never been in a bomber, when someone says, jet left, you don't know the specific kind of fear that word created at the end of the war. Guns swing too slow. Your pilot can't outturn it. You are a metal barn floating in the sky watching a wolf on fire close distance. 0810. A red tail element spotted an Me-262 lining up on the bomber stream. The Mustangs rolled to intercept. You need to picture this exactly, because this is the moment that turns into legend later, and you can't understand the respect unless you understand the geometry. The P-51 was not as fast in a straight line as the Me-262. So you don't catch a 262 by chasing it, you catch it by predicting it. One of the red tail pilots, Captain Roscoe Brown, dove not at where the jet was, but at where the jet had to go. He cut across the Germans' firing line, high to low, fast enough that his canopy blurred. That move wasn't flashy, it was math. He was saying, if you keep coming, you're dead. If you break off, you lose the shot. The Me-262 broke. A B-17 crewman later said, I saw the red tail come across my nose and I just thought, thank God those boys are here. Listen to that. Those boys. In 1943, that same crew, that same type of crew, might have refused to bunk near a black airman on base. By 1945, at 30,000 feet over Berlin, they were praying for those same men. That shift didn't come from speeches. It came from survival math. By 0830, the red tails were still welded to the bomber group. No wandering, no hunting, no, "I'll be right back, I've got one on my scope." They held. That's the part bomber crews started whispering about in tents and cots and latrines. They don't leave you. It sounds simple. It wasn't. You're in a Mustang. You see an enemy fighter flash past your nose, giving you the shot every pilot dreams about. You've trained your whole life for this moment. You can almost feel the trigger under your finger. And you don't go. Because if you go, and if one bomber dies while you're off chasing glory, the whole system calls you undisciplined. And maybe the whole squadron gets grounded, and maybe nobody black flies combat again. Imagine flying with that kind of leash on your heartbeat, and still being lethal. Because they were. Multiple German fighters went down that day, some from direct kills, some because the red tails forced them off the bombing run and made them break away, made them lose speed, made them bleed options until they were just targets. You want numbers? Here are numbers. On deep escort missions like this, loss rates for bombers could hit 5, 6, 7 planes in a single group. That's 50, 60, 70 men not coming back. One morning, under Red Tail escort, there were missions with 0 bombers lost, 0. And on March 24th, 1945, during a strike deep into German airspace against targets feeding the collapsing Rhine line, the bomber crews who made it home understood why. It wasn't luck. It wasn't mercy. It was discipline. It was controlled. Aggression. It was a promise kept at gunpoint. "I didn't care what color they were," one bomber pilot said later. "I just knew those red-tailed fighters stayed with me all the way in, and they were still there when we turned for home." Hold that sentence. All the way in. Still there when we turned for home. That is loyalty measured in miles under fire. By 9 as the bomb loads were dropped and half of Berlin seemed to be clawing at the sky with flak and tracer, something else happened that nobody wrote in the official mission summary. Fear flipped. For years, the insult had gone one direction. You can't trust black pilots in combat. But now, up there, with fuel gauges dropping and engines coughing and oxygen masks frosting from each breath, the fear ran the other way. What if we don't get them next time? What if command doesn't assign them to us tomorrow? What if we draw some other escort, the kind that peels off? That's respect. Raw, unpolished, unpretty, survival respect. The kind that changes cultures faster than any memo. By late morning, as the formation began to wheel away from Berlin and turn toward the long road back to Italy, the radio got quieter. Adrenaline drains fast. When it goes, you feel hollow. Heavy. Crews check each other. You alive? You good? You bleeding? Then comes the roll call. 2's here. 3's here. 4, report. 4, report. 4, where the hell are you? And on that day, the day that matters for this story, far more voices answered than expected. More bombers answered than should have. Men who, by the percentages, should have died over Berlin were still on the radio. And every one of them knew why. Not because racism had ended in 6 hours. It hadn't. Not because the United States suddenly believed in equality. It didn't. But because in the most dangerous airspace left in Europe, when German jets screamed in, when flak turned daylight into black static, the escorts with red tails never left. That is the arithmetic of doom. Not doom for the bomber crews, doom for the lie. The lie said, they can't handle pressure. Reality said, they held formation over Berlin. The lie said, they'll panic when it gets bad. Reality said, they were still on our wing when we were already writing goodbye letters in our heads. The lie said, they don't belong in the cockpit of a fighter. Reality that morning, at 30,000 feet over the heart of Nazi Germany, said, without them, you don't get home. And every man who landed understood that. They didn't all say it out loud yet. That would come later. In a small debrief room, under a yellow light, with smoke in the air, maps on the wall, and somebody finally whispering the sentence no one would have dared say 2 years earlier. We want the red tails. Which is where we go next. Night, southern Italy, a temporary operations hut. Near the airfield, wood walls, canvas roof, yellow light bleeding through cigarette smoke. The mission board was still up. Berlin, Pulitz, rail lines, black grease pencil arrows showing routes in and out of German airspace. Red X marks where flak had been heaviest. Nobody was laughing. People imagine debrief as loud. It isn't. After a mission like that, the first hour is mostly quiet anger and quiet relief. Pilots sitting with flight suits half open, hands still shaking a little from the engine vibration that's still living in the bones, jaw muscles clenched so hard it hurts. You're on the ground, but your body is still at altitude. One table held bomber crew, another held fighter escort, Tuskegee men, red tail men. And this is important. 2 years earlier, that sight alone would have been unthinkable. Black fighter pilots and white heavy bomber crews sitting in the same hot room trading oxygen-starved stories as equals. In 1943, some of these bomber crews wouldn't eat in the same building as black airmen. In March 1945, they were passing each other canteens. Reality moves faster in war than policy does on paper. A major from the bomber group unrolled a map and started walking through contact points. Flak here. Jet contact here. Lost visual here. His voice was steady, but the way he pressed his thumb into the paper told the truth. He wasn't relaxed. He was holding something down. Then he did something small, and that small thing is the center of this entire story. He looked up, not at the other white officers, not at his own navigator, but at one of the red-tail pilots across the table. And he said, "Quiet. How did you pick up that jet so fast? Not you people, not your outfit, not your colonel. You, second person, professional, respectful. That might sound like nothing to you. It wasn't nothing in 1945. The red-tail pilot, flight suit unzipped, collar damp with sweat, eyes still a little red from oxygen mask rub, answered simple. He was fast, he said. So I didn't chase his tail. I cut across the angle. He had to either break off the attack or eat 50 cal. Matter of fact, no brag. The major nodded. Wrote it down. Then it happened. It didn't come out like a speech. It wasn't dramatic. It slipped out in the tone of a man who has already decided and is now just speaking logistics. The major said, "For tomorrow's run, I want them." Somebody frowned. Them who? He didn't blink. The red tails. Silence. Not angry silence. Not "What did you just say?" silence. It was the silence of a room realizing a line had just been crossed and there was no going back. Understand what that sentence meant. For years, white bomber crews had joked that flying with Negro escorts was a political stunt. They said it in mess halls. They said it in write-ups. They said it on leave. Now, after Berlin, they were requesting those same men by name. Not because some general ordered integration, not because America had fixed itself, not because racism was gone. Because if you were going to ride a slow-falling metal coffin into Nazi Germany and try to bring it home in one piece, that you were not playing tribal pride anymore. You were playing survival. We want the red tails. That sentence was not supposed to exist. That sentence was not part of the design. Remember, Tuskegee was created to prove black pilots would fail, to show good faith, and then quietly bury them. Instead, inside a sweaty debrief room in Italy, frontline crews were saying, "Give us the men you said couldn't handle real combat." That is the moment the lie died, not in a courtroom, not in Washington, not in a newsreel, in a plywood hut that smelled like oil, sweat, flak dust, and Lucky Strike smoke. One of the Tuskegee pilots, younger than he looked in that light, didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't gloat. He just stared down at his hands, because he understood something too. Respect in that room didn't mean respect back home. Up there at 30,000 feet, they were Sir, escort, guardian angel. Stay with me, please God, stay with me. Down on the ground in uniform, in their own country, they were still colored. That's not poetry. That's the word. They knew it. So when that bomber major said, "We want the red tails," it felt like victory and warning at the same time. Victory, because the math had spoken, because discipline had spoken, because performance under fire had spoken louder than every slur in every briefing room. Warning, because everyone in that hut also knew this. One mistake could still erase all of it. If one red-tailed pilot got reckless tomorrow and left formation, if one bomber got cut in half after that, if one angry colonel wrote the wrong kind of report, command could snap back to the old line in a heartbeat. Undisciplined, we tried, shut them down. So even in the moment of respect, the pressure did not lift. It got heavier. Now it wasn't, "Prove you can fly." Now it was, "Prove you deserve to keep flying," again and again and again, with no right to fail even once. That's a different kind of war. You fight Hitler, and at the same time you fight the quiet expectation from your own country that you will embarrass them. Most Americans never had to fight both at once. The Red Tails did, every single sortie. There's another piece no one likes to admit, the shame. Not the shame of the Red Tails, the shame in the bomber crews. Some of those men had used the word boy in the mess hall. Some of them had said out loud, "I don't want any colored pilot near my group, they'll fold." Hours later, they'd watched a red-tailed Mustang throw itself between their bomber and a German jet. After the mission, they could still feel the vibration of that Mustang's guns firing. After the mission, they were alive. That creates a kind of quiet debt, a debt veterans almost never talk about because it hurts pride. That's what was in the air that night, not just relief. Debt, it tasted like metal. It tasted like swallowing something you didn't want to swallow. One of the gunners finally broke the silence in the hut. He didn't look up when he said it. He just muttered, "I ain't saying this twice, but if they ain't on my wing tomorrow, I ain't going." Nobody laughed. Nobody called him soft. Because nobody in that room actually thought he was joking. That's the moment. That, right there, that's the second the culture changed, not on paper but in muscle memory. From "I don't trust them" to "I don't fly without them." In war, that is a revolution. It does not come with speeches. It comes with a sentence half whispered over a map. We want the Red Tails. And that's when history quietly split in two, what the country still said in public, and what the men who had just come back from Berlin already knew in their bones. History books like to end in that room. We want the Red Tails, fade to black, roll credits. America learns its lesson. That's not what happened. The sky didn't stop killing people just because respect finally showed up. The 332nd Fighter Group, the Red Tails, kept flying. They kept escorting bombers. They kept diving on German fighters. They kept forcing Me-262 jets off firing lines over the last burning factories of the Reich. And they kept getting shot at. Here's the part almost nobody outside the community says out loud. Those men did not come home untouched. By the time the war ended, the Red Tails had flown more than 300 long-range escort missions. About 311, depending on how you count which sorties qualified. They were credited with shooting down over 100 German aircraft, piston and jet. They destroyed trains, locomotives, airfields. They got so good at protecting bombers that their reputation spread across bomber groups the way rumors spread in prison, quietly, fast, and trusted more than official orders. But all that came with a bill. 27 of them never made it back. 27, not planes lost, men, names, bodies that never walked back into the hut, chairs that stayed empty at chow for the rest of the tour, lockers that stayed closed because nobody wanted to touch them. If you've never served in a tight unit, 27 might sound like a number. It is not a number when you're inside. It's a map of holes. Every pilot in the Red Tails knew this. I cannot screw up. I cannot die stupid, because if I die stupid, they will use my blood to say we don't belong here. So they flew with double weight. Other American pilots flew for survival. The Red Tails flew for survival. And proof of discipline, proof of worth, proof of belonging in their own country's uniform. That pressure eats you. Ask yourself this: how do you celebrate staying alive on Monday, When you know that if you make one bad turn on Tuesday, you don't just die, you become evidence against everyone who looks like you, that is not hero story. That is psychological torture in slow motion. And still, they did the job. Let's name names because this matters. Lieutenant Lee Archer. He became one of the most effective black fighter pilots of the war. Some accounts, including men who flew with him, called him an ace. 5 confirmed kills. Official tallies argued the number. People still argue the number. You know why that argument exists? Because even after risking his life over Germany, the system he served was still hesitant to say, yes, this black pilot hit that mark. Captain Roscoe Brown. He was one of the pilots who engaged German jets, predicting their attack lines, forcing them off the bombers. After the war, he didn't vanish. He went on to get a doctorate. He became an educator. He spent his life talking about 2 things, discipline in the air and dignity on the ground. Lieutenant Charles McGee flew missions in World War II, then Korea, then Vietnam. 3 wars, 30 years in uniform. Ask yourself what kind of heart you need to put that much of your life in the air for a country that, in 1945, would not even let you sit and eat next to a white officer in some states. So what happened when they came home? That's the part America doesn't love to replay. The war in Europe ended May 1945. The killing stopped. But the lines on the ground were still segregated. On base in the United States, black airmen were still pushed into separate barracks, separate mess areas, separate clubs. Some of them, men who had saved white bomber crews over Berlin, were told by local police in uniform, "Don't stand here, don't use that door, don't act smart." There were towns in America in 1945 where a German POW, captured enemy, could sit at a diner counter in uniform, and a decorated black airman could not. Let that sit for a second. The Luftwaffe pilot who had tried to murder Americans in the air over the Rhine could be treated, on U.S. soil, with more casual respect than the black American who stopped him. That is not internet rage. That is documented reality in 1944 and 1945 at U.S. bases where German prisoners were used as labor. So no, it wasn't as simple as they proved themselves and then everything was fine. They proved themselves, and then they were asked to go home quietly. They proved themselves, and then they were told, wait your turn, change takes time. Time? Here's how long it took. The United States military did not begin full desegregation until 1948, after an executive order from President Truman. That's 3 years after Berlin, 3 years after we want the red tails. 3 years after the math was already obvious. 3 years of men walking around with medals in a country that still called them boy. And some of them never got even that. Long. Some of the 27 didn't see 1946. They didn't hear Truman's order. They didn't hear anybody say, you were right, you belonged. They died in European airspace working under rules designed to prove they didn't belong. That's the cost. Here's the other cost, the one nobody puts on a monument. Guilt. Survivor. Guilt is normal in combat units. You live, your friend doesn't, you carry it. That's war. Now add this. The bomber crews that came home because the red tails stayed on wing over Berlin, they carried their own guilt too, because deep down, a lot of them knew what it meant to say, we want the red tails. They knew what it meant to say it in 1945. It meant we were wrong. And that's hard for a man in uniform to say out loud. Pride is armor. Admitting you misjudged the man who saved you, that cracks the armor. So they didn't talk about it much. For decades, you hear polite phrases in public like, they were excellent escorts. They were very professional. They did a fine job. Fine job. That's how America described men who put their bodies between German guns and bomber crews who once laughed at them. A fine job. That's how a country avoids confessing it nearly killed its own future out of arrogance. But underneath those polite phrases, underneath the debrief notes and mission reports, underneath the neat language and the clean unit summaries, something permanent had already shifted. By the end of the war, bomber crews were not asking, can black pilots handle combat? They were asking, are the red tails on my wing tomorrow? That's not politics. That's instinct. That's muscle memory built under fire. And muscle memory is the one thing you don't get to rewrite after the war. It stays. That's why when you talk to surviving bomber crews years later, old men with soft voices and shaking hands, more than a few will still say it the same way. They saved us. I don't care what anyone said back then. They saved us. Not they were good, not they performed admirably. They saved us. So here's the cost. 27 dead. Dozens more injured. Careers spent under a microscope that nobody else had to live under. Respect earned at gunpoint in a country that refused to respect them on the ground. And here's the bill they sent back to America without saying it. You don't get to pretend we didn't do this. You don't get to say we weren't ready. We were ready over Berlin. We were ready when it mattered. We were ready when you weren't. That's aftermath. That's consequence. That's the part you don't see in the pretty black and white footage. Because the truth is simple and ugly. They didn't only help win the air war over Germany. They forced the United States to face itself. And the United States did not like what it saw. Berlin was quiet now. The fires had gone out. The smoke over the Tuskegee. Factories drifted into gray clouds that looked like snow. And somewhere above those clouds, the red tails of the Trekant were flying home, engines humming, fuel running low, silence inside the cockpits, the kind that comes only when you've survived something you shouldn't have. Down below, the city that was supposed to last 1,000 years was dust, and high above that dust flew men who had been told they weren't fit to fly. They called it discipline. They called it professionalism. They called it proof that Negro pilots could perform under pressure. Listen to those words. They sound cold now, because what the red tails gave wasn't performance. It was protection for men who didn't even want to believe in them, and they gave it anyway. That's what makes this story heavy. They won over Berlin, but they couldn't win over Alabama. They fought Hitler and came home to the same laws that told them where they could sit, where they could eat, and who they were allowed to be. They proved they were equal in the only courtroom that mattered, the sky, and the jury still refused to hear the verdict. So ask yourself, quietly, what do you call a nation that sends its bravest men to die for freedom, while refusing to give them freedom at home? What do you call a pilot who guards a stranger's life, knowing that stranger might not even shake his hand after landing? They called it duty. History calls it something deeper, a kind of moral defiance, silent, steady, measured in miles of escort over enemy fire. Because on March 24, 1945, at 30,000 feet over Berlin, America's lie about who was ready to fly died, not with a speech, not with a law, with an action, a wing that never broke formation. The Red Tails didn't just escort bombers, they escorted a nation through its own hypocrisy, and when they landed, nobody threw a parade. But the sky remembered. That's enough. History remembers the medals, the missions, the kills. Almost nobody remembers the quiet room in Italy where someone finally whispered, "We want the Red Tails." That whisper was the sound of a country beginning, very slowly, to learn what equality actually looks like, 30,000 feet above its own prejudice.